In the run-up to last weekend's white supremacist rally in Washington, NPR interviewed organizer Jason Kessler, who said he's not the bad guy everybody claims.
I'm not a white supremacist. I'm not even a white nationalist. I consider myself a civil and human rights advocate.
For what Kessler calls the underrepresented Caucasian demographic, a phrase host Noel King asked him to explain.
In what ways are white people in America underrepresented?
Well, because they're the only group that is not allowed to organize into political organizations and lobbies and talk explicitly about what interests are important to them.
Later, King pressed Kessler on his claim that there are fundamental differences between the races.
Do you think that white people are smarter than black people?
There is enormous variation between individuals, but the IQ testing is pretty clear that it seems like Ashkenazi Jews rate the highest in intelligence, then Asians, then white people, then Hispanic people, and black people.
All of which made Kessler sound like a racist pretending not to be one. But critics thought giving him a platform was a big mistake. Activist DeRay McKesson said NPR made white supremacy seem like a legitimate policy position, while the Washington Post's Karen Attiah thought the host's pushback was too weak. NPR's ombudsman wasn't impressed either, saying if the network insists on interviewing racists, it's got to do a better job. For better or worse, there's always next time. So I have to make a confession here. I actually saw on Twitter, I think it was Karen Attiah from the Post, complaining that NPR had Kessler on and was allowing him to rank the races in order of what he believes their intelligence is. And I retweeted her tweet and said if I were on Beat the Press this week, I would rant about this because I didn't like the idea of him being given a platform to do that. Problem was I hadn't listened to the interview. And when I actually went back and listened to it, as you usually should do before you tweet about something, everyone watching at home.
No, you're not supposed to do that.
I think Noel King did a pretty good job. She might not have been quite as tough at some points as she could have, but she prefaced everything by saying some of what you're about to hear is racist and offensive. And I thought she really did a good job getting Kessler to be his own worst enemy and to highlight the tensions between his various views. Also worth pointing out, Noel King, contrary to what some critics said, is a biracial woman. I believe the producer of Morning Edition is an African-American woman, and this was originally a one-hour interview that was condensed down to about 7 minutes.
Yeah, it's not that she didn't push back, and I do think there's this school of thought that needs to be refuted that if you're interviewing someone and you're not at every turn saying no, you're wrong, and here's why you're wrong, and I'm going to fact check this on the fly, that somehow you're not doing your job. That there are cases wherein it is appropriate to let someone hang himself with his own rope, and I think this was one of them. I think where the interview maybe went wrong, where I would critique it, is that whole intelligence thing. Because that, asking him an open-ended question about why he thinks some people are smarter than others perhaps is giving him a bigger platform than he deserved in that moment.
But wasn't it exactly that showed you that Jason Kessler is, in fact, a white supremacist?
Right.
But was there any doubt that he was a white supremacist?
Well, he was trying to make the point that he wasn't. They let him claim he wasn't, so...
I think that that's the great thing about having a platform as a journalist, is to invite various different kinds of voices onto your show or your segment, and you let the public decide. You put it out there into the spotlight and you let the public decide. Now, you can argue about did the person do a good job conducting the interview. But I think, the good stuff, you can applaud it, and the bad stuff, you can cringe, or it can motivate you to fight it. And I think not putting someone like that on television is to say that this does not exist. This is all around us, right? So those who argue we should not be giving these people a platform, just type any kind of thing that's close to race or races or white supremacists, and a million different things will pop up on your computer, which is where a lot of people get their information. So by not inviting someone on a show like that doesn't mean that people aren't going to have access to this information. So the only issue then is when you do have someone on, just make sure that you do prod and ask the kinds of questions that will push back on what these people are spouting, and not just give them a platform to talk for 7 minutes. I'm not saying that's what she did, but that's something that you should keep in mind.
The NPR ombudsman, Elizabeth Jensen, wrote extensively about this, and I thought she had the best solution to something like this, and unfortunately there was some very bad news in there too. She said that the interview should have been used as part of a reported piece with other voices, something that would offer the full context, and instead of just giving this guy a platform for 7 minutes, although I agree with you that Noel King did a pretty good job of pushing back. Unfortunately, Elizabeth Jensen also wrote that NPR is moving away from doing reported pieces, and they want to do more interviews. And I have to say, I find that incredibly dispiriting, because that would have been the way to handle this.
I think one problem with this particular incident speaks to the way people consume journalism and how it's changed. This interview was a 7-minute interview, which seems like a lot of airtime, was part of a larger grouping of stories, a package of stories that was spread out throughout the day and throughout the week. And people don't tune in to the same place every day at the same time to hear all 8 parts of a package over the course of 5 days. They just don't. They tune in when they can. They get a little bit here, a little bit there. So a 7-minute interview that's part of something, it's missing its context when you're driving home and you flick on NPR and you're listening to it for the next few miles.
Or more to the point, when you hear it on Twitter.
Or when you see people raging about it on Twitter. Absolutely. We just don't consume news that way anymore, or information that way. I think it also speaks to the fact that while Noel is of color and while her producer is of color, the vast majority of NPR's audience is not. And so there's this tendency to either preach to a choir or to stir up your base. So the people who need to be informed about what this guy really thinks are people who don't encounter this kind of racism in real life. So they're either going to be outraged about it or surprised about it, but to those of us who have encountered it, this isn't surprising, and nor is it newsworthy.